talked about so far, we talked about Surat Al-Fatiha, I talked about the general outlining of Surat Al-Baqara, kind of what it talks about in general, the divisions that is divided into introduction, the first part and the second part. The first part is basically the first juz' of Surat Al-Baqarah, from ayah number 30 to ayah 141, like the end of the first juz'. And the message in it is very simple, and it's very obvious and very clear. It's telling you are a Khalifa. That's your job, that's your mission, that's who you are as a human, that's what you're here to do, that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created you, that's the purpose He brought you here to fulfill. And He gave you an example of Adam alayhi salam being the first Khalifa. He talked about Bani Israel, the people who were given the same job and made many mistakes for us to learn from, and then give you the example of those who were given the job and did it well, like Ibrahim and Yaqub alayhi salam. And the final part of that first chapter was advice for us. We talked about all that. The second part of Surat Al-Baqarah is the methodology of achievement, meaning when you're given a job, you expect someone to explain to you how you're going to do it or what tools you're going to use in order for you to fulfill this purpose or to achieve your goal. And the methodology that you're given is what is Islam itself, is all the rulings and all the halal and haram and all the things you're supposed to do and not supposed to do within Islam. And basically from the beginning of the second juz' of Surat Al-Baqarah, that starts, and we start hearing, and things change dramatically in Surat Al-Baqarah. If you're memorizing the first juz' of Surat Al-Baqarah, the second juz', they're very different. Like they're not similar at all. Because the first juz' was just telling you what to do and giving you examples of those who did it before you, mistakes that were made and proper things that were done. And then the second juz' changes, and now you hear about all these different ahkam, all these different rulings, and it's not done in a way that you would suggest. I mean, if you were to suggest the way this is going to be done, you'd probably start with salah, then siyam, then zakat, then hajj, then move on to this to certain rulings of finance, then maybe rulings of social regards, but that's not how the surah does. The surah actually goes from one issue, one topic to the other, and that's where we kind of start from details of the methodology regarding food, regarding behavior, regarding retribution, inheritance, and it goes from one thing to the other. It's not random. Rather, what it's trying to say is that this is the landscape here is horizontal. Meaning all these things are similarly important. He's not going to give it from a priority perspective. The methodology is either taken as a whole or it's not. Either you take it all, and you hear that in Surah Al-Baqarah many times. أَفَتُؤْمِنُونَ بِبَعْضِ الْكِتَابِ وَتَكْفُرُونَ بِبَعْضِ. You're going to believe in a bit of it and then disbelieve in a bit of it. It doesn't work. This is a whole methodology. You have to take the whole thing. He doesn't start by the most important and moving on to the least important, because then you'll say, well, at least I took the first 80% of it and the last 20 I messed up. But no, he started talking about food. Then he moved on to something as intimate and as important as behavior. Then he went after that to something as simple as retribution, something that you don't really go through much in life. Then he moves on to inheritance. Then he comes back again to fasting, siyam. And you're like, where is the pattern? It's not. He purposefully, subhanahu wa ta'ala, didn't put it in a pattern to kind of show you that the landscape is horizontal. It's all the same. You have to take it all. Just take the whole thing. And it's presented to us through the struggle of life itself. Meaning you hear the whole, the ayat are being presented to us through either questions that are being answered or problems that have happened or may happen, making you feel that it's not going to be given to you as article number 1, article number 2, article number 3. No, it's going to be given through us within the struggle, because life is dynamic, and that's how things are going to be. There's a bit of chaos. It's a bit messy. Life in general is a bit messy, and the way this is going to be presented is more similar to life than to theory. We don't like studying theory because it's not practical. That's why we actually have these two things. We have the theory and then the practical. Why do we need two things? Shouldn't it be one? Why do we need two divisions all the time? Why is theory and the practice different? It just is, because as humans, that's how you like to present things. We like to present things all shiny and clean. Number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. That's how we enjoy it. But that's not how it's done in life. Not even close. Not by a long shot. Life is much more chaotic. Just more dynamic, let's say. And when you read Surat Al-Baqarah, as it goes through the methodology, it doesn't go through number 1, 2, 3, 4, as clean and shiny as we would like to see it. It goes through it in the same chaotic sense that it will happen in life itself. Because in life, you'll go from one of these things to the other with no warning. Meaning, in your life, your life is not organized where you're going to have to deal with this issue in the morning, this issue in the afternoon, this issue. No, it's just going to happen all at once in this big mesh. It's this big movement that you can't really control, and that's how the ayat presented. So the Quran, when it tries to present issues like this, it tries to do it practically for you, so you get this the gist of it even prior to actually happening. So that's why, well, it's very simple. The second part of Surat Al-Baqara, unlike the first part of Surat Al-Baqara, where I had to do a lot of explaining and give you examples exactly what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about regarding the behavior of Bani Israel, the mistakes that they made and the things that we're supposed to do to be better so that we don't make the same mistakes. Here it's very clear cut. It's just each paragraph is talking about a certain ruling and what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. And you know the issue. Like when I say regarding food, I don't need to tell you exactly what the ayat said. You know what the ayat said. You do it every day. You don't eat certain things, you eat other things. And the same thing goes for behavior. You know basically what the behavior is going to be about. You know that you're supposed to have integrity and loyalty and honesty and proper and kindness and tenderness with others. That's all clear to you. But this is how Surat Al-Baqarah presented it. And it went through, and the beauty of these points is that they go through everything. They don't leave anything untouched. Every part of life is talked about. Every angle, even issues that you don't think. Inheritance, how much does inheritance come up in life? What, when you die, you're alive. If it doesn't die, that doesn't happen every day. And rarely are you the person who was involved in taking care of all this. But you'll find it in Surat Al-Baqarah. It'll talk about it. Not as detailed as in Nisa, as we'll go through in detail then, but it's there. The concept is brought up. So regarding fasting, regarding corruption, meaning being corrupted, being someone who looks for shortcuts and tries to weasel his way out of things or into things to get what he wants. Corruption as a part of life, as something that has a ruling attached to it within Islam. Because if you're going to talk about a methodology, this methodology better be complete. It needs to be full. It can't leave issues that it doesn't talk about in general. And Surat Al-Baqarah talks generally about everything. And it's all done within the second juz'ah. The second juz'ah also, the second part, also has an introduction. Just go up a second, because I forgot to go. So as a reminder, there's an introduction. The introduction point, just right there, yeah. So the introduction point has a few points. And the points are important. That you always have direction. You always have a qibla. This is very important. Before he starts telling you about the method, reminding you that you always have a reason. There's a direction for you. You're not walking aimlessly in this world. And for 2 pages it goes on about wijha and about qibla. And it uses the word time and time again that you do have a direction. You were created and there's a purpose and there's a destination that you're moving towards. Never forget that. Why is he saying this? Because when he starts talking about food and inheritance and corruption and fasting and hajj, within this big movement, and you start learning what to do and what not to do, you can forget within the midst of all that why you're doing it. It becomes a habit to you. That's how I live. I don't eat this, I eat that, I act like this, I pray 5 times a day, I fast during this month, I do hajj, But why do you do it all? You can easily forget. And the concept in the introduction of the second juz'ah talked about it brought up a few issues so that you would never forget. So that would never be a problem for you. You always remember that you have a direction. There's a qibla. You're moving in a certain direction. You have a certain destination. It's not an aimless movement. It's talking about the value of rituals. That rituals have value. Just because you like the idea of being a khalif and you like the ethics and morals that are attached to it, doesn't mean that rituals are meaningless and that rituals are useless. They do have importance because a lot of the rulings that we're going to be reading about are rituals. Certain things you're going to do and certain things you're not going to do. And you may not make sense of each and every one of them. And you can say, well, I don't need to actually stand and do salah. I can sit and do salah. I can just think of good thoughts and connect with Allah, the spiritual. Yes, but He wants the ritual. He's asked specifically for the ritual. He wants it done like that. That there's importance to that. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks you to do something a certain way, you oblige. You do it a certain way He asked you to do it, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's an issue in Islam that's very important. It's touched on within this introduction of the second juz of Surat Al-Baqarah, and it'll be talked about in more detail later in surahs that kind of are dedicated to talking about that aspect. Another part of the introduction, never withhold knowledge, and the third one is remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Never withhold knowledge is a part of is something that we need to be reminded of before the methodology. Because this methodology is large. There's a lot of information here. None of it is to be withheld. None of it. You have no right to withhold a piece of knowledge. Especially when you feel that withholding it may serve you. I'm not going to tell you the full story. I'll just tell you the part of the story that serves my agenda so you do what I want you to do. And that's haram. That is one of the worst things you can do with a deen. That's how you corrupt a deen. That's how you ruin a religion. That's how you ruin a faith. That's how you ruin an ummah. by lying, by withholding knowledge, by not telling the full story, by not being objective and not being sincere when you relay a message to people after you've learned. You may be thinking, well, this is not important. It's very important. You're going to see the importance of it soon in your life. Right now, you may not have a reason to have an agenda, but as time progresses, you will start to find that you will, and you do. And in your home, you'll find that you do as well. And the people that will challenge you about this the most will be your children. The people who will challenge you the most regarding something like this will be your children first. They will challenge you every day. Challenge your agendas every single day. And you'll try and don't, it's not okay. It's not okay. It's not, you don't do it in the house, you don't do it outside either. If you accept the methodology that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave, you don't withhold anything. It's all out there. You don't have to like what people do with it. You don't have to agree with what people do with it. You still have to share it. And the final thing is Allah. Never forget Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're doing it for Him. That's why. He is the intention trigger. It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To please Allah, to be with Allah yawm al-qiyamah. Nothing else matters. Everything else is completely worthless. Anything else I tell you is just something to maybe motivate you a bit more. But nothing else matters really. It's just that the will, the desire to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and be with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nothing else. Anything else I give you is just an addition. Something you don't really need. Stand with the Ummah, stand by Islam, it's all nice, but why are you doing all this? It's one reason and one reason only. It's for the sake of Allah. Then that makes you remind yourself before you do something. With this action that I'm going to perform in a few minutes, would it really please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And that's a fresh perspective. Yes, He told you certain things don't eat, behave in a certain way when it comes to corruption, and that's all good, and you should follow the rulings. But before you follow the rulings, you always have that part of the introduction to remind yourself, would this actually please Allah, the way I'm doing it? And that challenges you for a moment. Would it really please Allah? Then you'll stop for a second, well, I don't feel like it. For some reason, I don't feel like this is pleasing Allah. I don't know why. Even though it seems to be a part of the faith, then you go and ask questions. You find out they've been doing it wrong, maybe. Or the intention behind it was not proper, or this is not the right timing for it. Very important part is the introduction of this second juz'ah. Talked about a few points that should be carrying in your mind as you're hearing him talk about regarding this and regarding that, and this obviously. So let's move on. So we arrived, I think, regarding, so we talked bearing arms for the sake of defense. So we talked about that. The first ayah being, وَقَاتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ الَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَكُمْ, and fight for the sake of Allah those who fight you. This is the first time fighting came up in Quran. The first time it was ever touched upon. The first time the word qital actually was read, if you're starting from the beginning of the Mus'haf and going forward, this is the first time you'll hear the word. The first time you hear it, this is the context that you're listening, that you're hearing. And fight for the sake of Allah those who fight you. وَلَا تَعْتَدُوا, and do not transgress. إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُعْتَدِينَ. Indeed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not love those who transgress. This is the anchor verse regarding, this is what you hold every other verse to, because it's the first one, and it's the clearest one of all. وَأَتِمُّ الْحَجَّ وَالْعُمْرَةَ لِلَّهِ. From that ayah, basically to ayah number 203, all these ayat are just talking about Hajj, and the rituals of Hajj, and what's acceptable in Hajj and what's not acceptable in Hajj, just the ritual of Hajj and how it's supposed to be done. Now you can go back to the theme. We won't need to use this too often because they're pretty simple. Regarding hypocrisy, from ayah 204 to ayah 214. Talking about nifaq. وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يُعْجِبُكَ قَوْلُهُ فِي الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا وَيُشْهِدُ اللَّهَ عَلَى مَا فِي قَلْبِهِ وَهُوَ أَلَدُّ الْخِصَامِ وَإِذَا تَوَلَّى سَعَى فِي الْأَرْضِ لِيُفْسِدَ فِيهَا. And some people, you like the way what they say, you like the way they say it, but inside their hearts is a whole different issue. Their hearts are filled with disease and with hatred. And when they walk away, everything that they do causes corruption in this earth and causes harm. And if you remind them of Allah, وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُ اتَّقِ اللَّهَ أَخَذَتْهُ الْعِزَّةُ بِالْإِثْمِ. This is a very scary one. وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُ اتَّقِ اللَّهَ, it's ayah number, right there, 206. And when you tell someone like that, this is one of the hallmarks of a hypocrite. When they're told, fear Allah in what you're doing, think of Allah, be someone of piety. أَخَذَتْهُ الْعِزَّةُ بِالْإِثْمِ. If they're sinning or doing something wrong, they become more and more arrogant regarding their sin. أَخَذَتْهُ الْعِزَّةُ بِالْإِثْمِ. It's a very specific phrase in the Quran. You don't find anywhere else. When we make mistakes and when we sin, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is generous enough to send our way someone to remind us of that, or to point it out to us, we are stuck in one of two options in front of us. Either we are humble enough to accept, correct, this is wrong. The way I behaved, what I said, what I'm doing is not proper and not fit. Or vanity and arrogance kick in and we begin defending our mistake. And we begin pointing out the mistakes of the person in front of us. And we begin justifying why we're doing it. And we turn this into a lifelong problem. And we start going, if you've ever been in a situation where you're looking for a sheikh to try and prove that what you're doing is right, then you fell into this at least once before. At some point, we're looking to text someone to try to prove that what you were doing was right, and you're hoping that he says yes. If he says no, then you look for another sheikh immediately because you want to hear that someone agrees with the wrong thing that you were doing. Then you fell into this. This happened before. It's one of the in these verses that we're reading, verses regarding hypocrisy, because even hypocrisy is an issue. The methodology, the second juz, talks about everything. We'll talk about every aspect of the deen, every aspect. We'll go through every aspect with no exceptions. And hypocrisy is one of them. And it doesn't come in a section where it's talking about spiritual or behavioral issues. No, it comes in the midst of talking of Hajj. And then right after it's going to be something that has nothing to do with it at all. It's just, and that's how Surat Al-Baqara puts it together. It's a horizontal landscape of just things to do and not to do and how to behave. They're all similar. You cannot accept one and not accept the other. I always imagine that if he had talked about them subhanahu wa ta'ala al-Baqarah in a vertical way, starting with the most important and moving down, then it'd be very easy for us to overlook the ones that came at the end. Because these are not as important. From a priority perspective, they're not priority-wise, they're not very important. He talked about them last, subhanahu wa ta'ala. But here, no, that's not how he did it. He talked about things from all over, because they're all the same. If you've accepted Islam as your method, as your way of life, then you accept all of it. You just take it all. Every aspect of it, regardless of what the field is. You cannot have an exception. There can't be a point or a part of life where here, this part here, this is mine. God doesn't rule this part. If you say that, then you've already you've drifted. Doesn't work. Islamically, it doesn't work. It doesn't work for anything, but especially for Islam, it definitely doesn't work for that. Go back to the slides again. So it's something to kind of think about. The point after that, regarding charity, from so ayah number 215, for example, when he says, subhanahu wa ta'ala, يسألونك ماذا ينفقون قل ما أنفقتم من خير فللوالدين والأقربين واليتامى والمساكين وابن السبيل. They ask you, what do we spend our wealth on, what we don't have and what we don't need. قل ما أنفقتم, what you will spend from khayr, then for your parents and for those who are related to you and for orphans and for those who are in need. Start with your parents and move on to those who are, your circle gets bigger. Your khayr goes to those who are the closest to you. And then once you've done that, you move your khayr outside the circle. The circle gets bigger as you move along. You don't start with someone far away when you have people right beside you who are in need. Specifically when we talk about relatives and kin. Those who you have kinship, you don't move outside before you take care of them first. Even if that's something that we don't necessarily like, but it's still a very important part of the deen. Ayah from 216 to 218. Regarding bearing arms for the sake of freedom of religion. There's two bearing arms in Surat Al-Baqarah. And they're talked about separately in two different parts. 195, going back a few verses before, from 190 to 195, subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke about bearing arms, but for a reason that was different than the reason for this one. There it was in defense. وَقَاتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ الَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُوكُمْ. When you are transgressed against, then you fight back. Then you fight back and you defend yourself and you don't transgress against others. Then it was talked about again in a separate paragraph, as we see here, from 216 basically. But it's for a different reason. كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْقِتَالُ وَهُوَ كُرْهٌ لَكُمْ وَعَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ وَعَسَىٰ أَن تُحِبُّوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ شَرٌ لَكُمْ وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ وَأَنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. It's been mandated upon you that you will fight. And many times, that's what I was saying, and many times you will hate something that is good for you, and you will love something that is not good for you, and you don't always know, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does. You don't always know what's actually good for you. We don't have the ability to always know what is going to be in our best interest. Then the ayah after that continues, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الشَّهْرِ الْحَرَامِ قِتَالٍ فِيهِ قُلْ قِتَالٌ فِيهِ كَبِيرٌ. The story here is actually quite interesting. See, the Prophet ﷺ once sent a group of the Sahaba on a mission, and they were supposed to go and do this mission, and it was during the Ashhur al-Haram. was during the sacred months, and he told them, "Do not, it's the sacred months, don't harm anyone. Just bring me information." It came back, come back, and what happened was that there was actually a fight that went between them and the others, and someone was killed in the midst. They were ambushed, and they fought back, and they ended up killing someone, and this became a problem. And they came back to the Prophet ﷺ, and he was very angry. The man who led the Sariyah, his name was Abdullah ibn Jahsh radiallahu anhu, and this was a great Sahabi, and for the rest of his life, he died in Uhud. He would always say that I never forgave myself for how angry I made the Prophet ﷺ because I didn't listen to what he told me to do. He was very clear with him in terms of his command. So don't cause any problems, don't hurt anyone. And then they started saying, the Quraysh loved this because they started to use it. Muhammad's killing people in the sacred months. He's acting like he's reviving the heritage of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and he's going around and he's doing all the haram things that Ibrahim said not to do. So the Quran came in these ayat here, and it addressed the issue, and it told the Muslims that what you did was wrong. قُلْ قِتَالٌ فِيهِ كَبِيرٌ. What you did in fighting during the sacred months was a big mistake, was a huge mistake. وَصَدٌّ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. But he said, وَصَدٌّ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَكُفْرٌ بِهِ وَالْمَسْجِدِ الْحَرَامِ وَإِخْرَاجُ أَهْلِهِ مِنْهُ أَكْبَرُ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ. However, if you can do that, would be great. Yeah. However, pushing people, removing people from the Bayt al-Haram, and then forcing them to leave their faith is worse in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These verses here, when they talked about fighting for the sake of Allah, it was for the sake of maintaining your freedom to believe in what you want to believe in. And it's different. It's not the same thing. When you look at the Quran, you're stuck with these two things only. Meaning, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about qital, and we'll see the third example in Surah Al-Nisa, one of three things is going to come up. Surah Al-Baqara has two, and then the third one we'll find in a different surah. Either you're doing it because you've been transgressed against, and your haqq has been taken away. So you fight back to maintain your right, to defend yourself and defend your land, and defend your wealth and defend your integrity. That's your right and that's your obligation Islamically. Number two, if someone is to transgress against your freedom, meaning your freedom to believe, your freedom to live, your freedom to learn, your freedom to do whatever it is that you want to do. If that is something that is compromised, then you also fight for that, for maintaining freedom. And the third thing is for the oppression of others. And that will come in Surah Nisa separately. If others are oppressed, if there's a group of people who are being transgressed against and mistreated, then you're also obligated to stand up for them as well. But these are three reasons. These are the only three reasons that you find in the Quran. And in Surah Al-Baqarah, it talks about two of them because they're a part of the methodology that we live by. The third one is more of a value system that we'll talk about inshallah when it comes. But here, these are two issues regarding the method. There is difference between the way we look at it and maybe, for example, how Christians look at it. It's not the same, at least faith-wise. From a biblical or from a text perspective, it's not the same thing. When you look at the text in the Bible, they're not commanded to fight back. There is no command for them to actually bear arms, to defend themselves, or to maintain their freedom of religion. That's not what they're told. But in Islam, we are told that there are moments where you are commanded and you are asked to bear arms. This ayah came early on during the Prophet ﷺ's hijrah, meaning just after he went to Medina, he was given these verses, and the reason being that in Mecca you weren't allowed to bear arms. When the Muslims when they were oppressed in Mecca, they weren't allowed to bear arms for any reason at all because they didn't have a state. They didn't have their own country yet. You lived within a society. Within that society, you follow the rules. You don't like the rules, you leave. You don't like the laws. If they're not fair to you, you leave. You don't bear arms within a society. You can't decide that you're going to change how the society functions, by violence. That's not going to happen. But once the Muslims had their own state, now there was a new ruling, and the ruling was that sometimes you have to bear arms. And many of the Muslims didn't like it. The Muslims weren't excited about this. That's why if you read the ayah, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْقِتَالِ وَهُوَ كُرْهٌ لَكُمْ. You've been mandated to fight, and it's something you do not like. You hate it. But you know what? Sometimes you'll hate something that's good for you, and you'll love something that's not good for you. Muslims weren't bloodthirsty. Neither is the deen. And there's nothing to be ashamed of. See, what strikes me as odd is that when we talk about these issues, it becomes very uncomfortable in the room when you talk about them. And everyone feels very self-conscious. I don't know why. Every country on the planet takes pride in defending itself, in defending its values, in defending its freedoms. Every single country on the planet will talk about this openly, and they'll salute those who do it. And then when we even talk about it conceptually, just conceptually as Muslims, somehow we manage to feel self-conscious and embarrassed about it. I don't know why. Well, I know why. But the idea is it doesn't make sense for us to continue to feel like that. It just makes no sense. Right now, is this being practiced properly anywhere? No, it's not. But it's still a part of the deen. It's still a part of the method that we're supposed to live by. That you do defend your rights, and specifically you defend your right to believe, your freedom to believe whatever you want to believe and to think and speak what you want. You defend that, even if you have to put your life on the line for it, you do it. There's nothing embarrassing, there's nothing shameful about that at all. Just because certain people used it in a negative way doesn't mean it's something that we have to spend the rest of our lives feeling ashamed about. This is very important. It's a very important part of Islam. You can't keep on dancing around verses where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is teaching us lessons. These lessons are important. Because it's not just about fighting. It's also about sacrifice. See, the concept of fighting, with it comes sacrifice. And sometimes one will exist without the other. Sometimes you fight and you don't actually sacrifice anything, you come back. And sometimes you sacrifice, meaning you'll lose, but you don't really actually fight. And sacrifice is an important concept. That you stand your ground for what is important, even if that costs you your life. That itself has faded away. Like that concept, because we don't talk about this anymore, that's been sucked out. And we can't afford to lose that one. Yes?
So this is regarding the state, Islamic state.
Yeah.
When you have to fight for the freedom of religion, the state for your religion.
So let's say, for example, let's go back to the Prophet ﷺ story himself. Did the Muslims, even though they had a state, did they have freedom of their own faith? Meaning, were they free to practice Islam within Arabia without being oppressed? No, they weren't. And they weren't free to speak of it. And that's why one of the reasons that the Prophet ﷺ bared arms, he and the Sahaba, was that. So it wasn't always defending Medina. Sometimes it was, and sometimes it was for their freedom. I have the right to be Muslim. You don't have to like it, I have the right to be it. And Quraysh said, no, you don't. And we will boycott you, and we will oppress you, and we'll use every resource that we can to make sure that you don't have the ability to do that. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if that's happening, then you fight back. Then you need to stand your ground, you need to bear arms, if that's the case. Today, do we have examples of that happening here? No, of course not. Here in Canada, none of this applies now, or here specifically. But it may elsewhere, and it may in the future. And not every hukum that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put is something you're going to practice every day. Some ahkam you may not practice throughout your whole life. When he talks about zakah in a bit, you may practice zakah in your life, and you may not. You may never make enough money to pay zakah. That's fine. It doesn't take away anything from your deen. You still have to acknowledge the hukum. You still have to acknowledge the ruling. You still have to acknowledge that it's a part of the methodology. You don't have to practice everything. Hajj, you may never have enough money to go make hajj. Does that mean Hajj doesn't exist for you? No, you still acknowledge the concept of Hajj. The ayat still means something. It's still important for you to learn. Even if you don't end up practicing, that's fine. But learning the deen, knowing what is right and wrong, knowing what you stand for, knowing what your way of life consists of is what's important. And yeah, again, talking about this issue specifically is its own lecture. But the concept, I think, is simple enough for us to appreciate. How do I make this small again? Okay, good, perfect. That's good. No, that's not what I wanted.
It's a different window.
Okay. All right. So the point after that, 219, regarding alcohol and gambling. It talks about يسألونك عن الخمر والميسر قل فيهما إثم كبير ومنافع للناس وإثمهما أكبر من نفعهما ويسألونك ماذا ينفقون قل العفو. It's very specific how the issue of gambling and alcohol is talked about in Al-Baqara, and then talked about in Nisa, and then talked about in Ma'idah. And the way that they're talked about is a good example of understanding how these surahs work in terms of purposes. Here's the methodology, the way of thought. This is how we think about things. This is how we go by different issues of life. And Nisa is going to give us values This is your value system. And then Ma'idah is going to give you very specific rulings. It's going to say halal, haram. That's all Ma'idah does. You do this, don't do this. Without touching on the reasons of almost anything. Why? Because it's already touched on the value system in Nisa, and it's touched upon, and it was talked about as a method or a way of thought and a way of life in Surat Al-Baqara. So the way it was done here in Surat Al-Baqara, it says, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْخَمْرِ وَالْمَيْسِرِ. They ask you about khamr, about alcohol, and maisir, about gambling. Say, فِيهِمَا إِثْمٌ كَبِيرٌ. There's a lot of sin within them. وَمَنَافِعُ لِلنَّاسِ. And sometimes there's benefit for people. وَإِثْمُهُمَا أَكْبَرُ مِنْ نَفْعِهِمَا. However, the sin and the harm within them outweighs by far the good that may come from them. This is the methodology. This is how we think about things. It's teaching you how to think about it. You look at it. What is it? Wallahi, most of the time it's harmful. Never ever is it not harmful. Sometimes people benefit. Every once in a while, someone wins the lottery and they're happy, right? Every once in a while, someone drinks, it doesn't do something stupid. Every once in a while. But for the majority of time, when you consume alcohol, you're harming yourself, and when you're gambling, people are being harmed all the time. So as long as that's the methodology, then that's how we look at it. It doesn't give you the hukum. We were told the story that this was an issue of tadarruj, meaning it was slowly, the hukum was going to slow. And I agree with that, that's actually what happened. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't put all three verses that talked about khamr and wana in one surah. He put them in different parts of the Quran, based on what these verses suited most in terms of purposes within the surahs. This surah is giving us the methodology, how we're supposed to think about things, how we're supposed to look at our outlook, our perspective. This is our way of life. This is how we look. You're asking about khamr and maisir, this is what they are. We'll give you the hukum in detail of haram later. We'll tell you this is haram clearly. But for now, here's the methodology that you carry. I think that's very interesting. And you'll find that throughout the Quran many times. And we'll talk about them inshallah when we can. So, the one after that, ayah number 20, regarding orphans. وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْيَتَامَى قُلْ إِصْلَاحٌ لَهُمْ خَيْرٌ وَإِن تُخَالِطُوهُمْ فَإِخْوَانُكُمْ وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ الْمُفْسِدَ مِنَ الْمُصْلِحِ وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْيَتَامَى قُلْ إِصْلَاحٌ لَهُمْ خَيْرٌ. If you perfect and you reform their homes for them, and if you teach them and give them money and teach them and raise them and take care of them, that's khayr. وَإِن تُخَالِطُوهُمْ. And if you bring them into your homes, فَإِخْوَانُكُمْ, then they're your brothers and sisters. And you'll treat them as if they're your own. You'll treat them as if they're a part of your families. وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ الْمُفْسِدَ مِنَ الْمُصْلِحِ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows those who take care of orphans, those who are using it for their personal benefit, and those who are actually trying to help them. If you live outside of Canada, see, North America, they standardize a lot of these things. So the state takes care of issues like this most of the time. So we're not in touch with most of these types of problems. But if you were to go back to the Middle East, when there are orphans, it's always families that are taking care of these things, and a lot of problems come from this. A lot of problems, more than I can explain to you. People fight all the time because this orphan, the parents left money. There's a certain amount of inheritance. And using and managing those funds and taking care of these children, and it caused a lot of problems, historically and today. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here in the methodology gives us a very simple idea. إِصْلَاحٌ لَهُمْ خَيْرٌ. If you reform their lives for them again, khayr, and if you allow them into your homes and treat them as if they're amongst your فَإِخْوَانُكُمْ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows those who are doing it for the right reason and those who are doing it for the wrong reason. I think it's a very important issue to think about. وَلَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ لَأَعْنَتَكُمْ. Listen to at the end of the ayah. وَلَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ لَأَعْنَتَكُمْ. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted, He wouldn't give you any children. Look at it. When you look at an orphan, and you say, no, I don't want to take care of this one. I want my own. Well, if you wanted subhanahu wa ta'ala, you would have, a'natak, you'd never get married or never have children. And then what you would have said. Understand what we're trying to say, subhanahu wa ta'ala? Before you say, no, I'm not going to be involved, or you're not going to love this kid or this orphan as much as you would love your own. You're not going to treat them the same way you would treat your own. Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if He wanted to, He could have, deprived you of ever having offspring yourself. So think about that maybe before you overlook something like this. Again, the way Surat Al-Baqara talks about things is you find it, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ, every couple of minutes, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ, they ask you. That's very dynamic. It's telling you, see, it's a problem of life. It's not saying number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ, they ask you, this is the answer. This is how you're supposed to look at it. This is your perspective of it. This is the methodology, this is the system, the life system that you're going to use to deal with these problems. It's showing you that these are issues of practicality. Allah Ta'ala. The one after that, regarding marriage, intermarriage relations, divorce or death, and getting engaged. Meaning everything from these are the ayat that the Huffaz find difficult. If you try to memorize the Quran, you'll come to these ones and then you'll change your mind. Starting from وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْمَحِيضِ وَلَا تَنْكِحُوا الْمُشْرِكَاتِ حَتَّى يُؤْمِنْ, ayah number 221. And then you keep on going from 221 to 237. It's quite a long chapter. It's almost exactly 4 pages, or just 4 pages short of an ayah, and it just goes through all the issues of what's okay, who's okay to marry, who's not okay, talking about divorce, talking about intermarriage relationships, talking about whether it ends with divorce or if it ends with a spouse passing away, and how to deal with all these things, how to get engaged, what to say, what's not, what allowed to say. So it kind of covers all those aspects of marriage. And I'll talk about a few of these ideas. وَلَا تَنْكِحُوا الْمُشْرِكَاتِ حَتَّى يُؤْمِنْ. And here was a hukum that was given very clearly that you're not to marry someone who is a pagan, or someone who does not believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Later, this hukum, or this concept of saying that you marry Muslims, you don't marry non-Muslims, was modified in Surat Al-Ma'idah. We'll talk about that then. It was modified slightly in Surat Al-Ma'idah with a twist to it. But the concept being at the beginning of the da'wah of the Prophet ﷺ in Medina is that Muslim men will look for Muslim women to marry, and Muslim women will look for Muslim men to marry. And that's all they really had to go by. And then the small modification was made later in Surat Al-Ma'idah. والمطلقات آية 228 والمطلقات يتربصن بأنفسهن ثلاثة قروء ولا يحل لهن يكتمن ما خلق الله في أرحامهن. Talks about how much time a lady who's divorced spends before she's allowed to marry again. الطلاق مرتان فإمساك بمعروف أو تسريح بإحسان. Talking about divorce is twice. You divorce twice, so you marry, a divorce happens, you can marry again, then divorce happens, you can marry again the same person, but after that, the third time, it's permanent. You can never go back into a relationship with this person again. فَإِمْسَاكٌ بِمَعْرُوفٍ. So either you hold on to this relationship بِمَعْرُوف, with good wills, good intentions, and good behavior, أو تسريح بإحسان, or let them go with ihsan, with excellence, and with good behavior as well. And the ayat goes to talk about all the details of how that's halal and what's allowed and what's not allowed. Basically, coming to the ayat 237, going through these actually from a fiqh perspective would take us maybe a year and a half to go through all these verses, because you have to actually take them all and then break down all the rulings that are attached to what's okay regarding marriage, what's not okay, what's proper to say, what's not. But I'm going to give you an example of an ayat that I think is important that we don't look at very often. So ayat number 235, he says, ولا جناح عليكم فيما عرضتم به من خطبة النساء أو أكننتم في أنفسكم علم الله أنكم ستذكرونهن. There's no haraj, there's no problem upon you or mistake that is held upon you regarding showing interest in getting engaged to a sister. أو أكننتم في أنفسكم, whether you make it semi-public or you keep it within your heart. علم الله أنكم ستذكرونه. You know subhanahu wa ta'ala that you will speak of them at some point, and you will bring this up. And this, the ayah after is what I want to touch base on. This is what he says. ولكن لا تواعدوهن سرا إلا أن تقولوا قولا معروفا. Don't speak to them privately unless you're going to say قول معروف. You're going to say something that the word ma'ruf is in a big and important linguistic complex that we have in the Quran. If you remember, when I gave an introduction to this whole series, I told there's a few concepts that I'll remind you of as I go along. One of them, that there are linguistic complexes. There are words, phrases, figures of speech that you'll find in the Quran. They're very specific, very important. You understand what they mean. So whenever you hear the word ma'ruf in the Quran, it's very important that you understand what he means, subhanahu wa ta'ala, by it. Ma'ruf is everything that is khayr, that people identify as khayr, socially. So anything that is good, that is identified by the society around you as good. Some things are good that people in society don't identify as good. Like something is khayr, but right now, socially, it's not seen as khayr. For whatever reason, it's not seen as khayr. And that's not ma'ruf. That doesn't fall under ma'ruf. Ma'ruf is everything that is khayr that people within society will easily point out and say that's a good thing. I mean, these are maxims, they're self-evident concepts that we all agree are good. So, لا تواعدوهن سرا. He's saying, do not speak to them privately unless you will say something ma'ruf. What will come from what you will say is something that is khair, that anyone in society, anyone will hear and say that's a good thing. That's khair right there. What was said is something khair. Are you understanding what I'm trying to say? ولكن لا تواعدوهن سرا إلا أن تقولوا قولا معروفا. The way I see it, and I'll tell you how I view this concept importantly. There's nothing wrong Islamically for a mature young man and a mature young woman to speak amongst themselves of marriage. There's nothing wrong with that. Culturally, maybe there is. Maybe culturally, depending on the family you come from, this is something that could have you beheaded. I don't know. It could be. But Islamically speaking, if a mature man would ask a mature woman for marriage, or the opposite, that's fine, as long as they follow this simple concept. إِلَّا أَن تَقُولُوا قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. When you speak with them privately, you only say something that is ma'ruf, that is of khair, that everyone agrees is khair. You can't say anything that could be understood in a negative way. Meaning you have to be extremely professional and extremely proper when you speak to them privately. You see, if you didn't put the illa, then I would tell you, I would be giving you a different story. وَلَكِنْ لَا تُوَاعِدُهُنَّ سِرًّا. And, Adnan, do not speak to them privately ever. And then I would continue, so you're never allowed to do it. But that's not what the ayah is saying. It gives an exception. You don't do it unless you're going to make sure you only say something that is ma'ruf. And if that is the story, then that's fine. And that's fine. Because Islamically speaking, there's nothing wrong with a man and a woman speaking about marriage in a positive way, in a ma'ruf way, even if not everyone in the world knows about it. Islamically, there's nothing wrong with that. Culturally, that's different. Culture and religion collide a lot. They do. They really do collide. And many of you listen to this and don't like it. That's not my problem. This is what the ayah says. It's your choice. You don't have to like this. This is what the ayah actually says. And you can go and look into the tafsir and say, but this ayah is regarding women who lost their husbands specifically. You can't prove that. That is unprovable. You cannot prove that this ayah is not generalized. You cannot do it. You'll try and you will fail because there's not enough evidence for you to actually be able to do that. That is very simple and very clear. To make it more difficult for you to disprove this is that the Prophet ﷺ himself got married because a lady approached him. He didn't approach Khadija, she did. She approached him. So when he got married, he was the one who was pursued. He didn't go and ask for to talk to Khadija. Khadija sent someone to talk to him. So when you look at the Prophet ﷺ's life and the seerah of the Sahaba, this was something very, very normal. It was very, very simple. For a man or a woman to see someone else and say, I'm interested in halal, I'm interested in marriage. Am I someone interesting to you, for you? Is this something interesting? Am I of any interest? No. Okay, I move on. Men had enough self-confidence not to care if women said no. Unlike today. They'll cry for 4 days and need therapy. Worth of if there be. No, they're fine. You don't want me? That's fine. Malak b'tayyib nasib. It's your loss. I move on to whoever's next. And women didn't care either whether they got, because there was enough self-confidence within who they were, and they understood that this is an issue of nasib. Meaning, this is what marriage is a very complex issue. It's not about your self-worth. It's not this whole idea, of course, because we've been watching Hollywood for so long now. We have these beliefs that everyone in the world has to want you in order for you to actually go ahead and get married. And you have to be wanted on a level that is majestic, that is actually beyond the grasp of what is normal in order for this to actually work, which is completely wrong. Every Hollywoodized relationship, look at their endings. Every movie ends when they get married. Right? Every movie, that's when it ends. When they're standing there and he says, I announce you, and then it ends. Why are you ending it now? Then show me 25 years into this. Then I'll be impressed. I'll be impressed 25 years into this if they still have the same. So we don't understand how this works. And because we don't understand how this works, this ayah doesn't make full sense to us. But it should. Because it's very simple. Marriage shouldn't be as difficult as it is today. These verses, I advise you, now that you know where they are in the Quran and that they talk about the methodology that we live by, go and read them. They talk about the whole issue. It's very open. The Quran talks about marriage and engagement and divorce and losing your spouse very openly. These things happen all the time. You get engaged and then you leave and then you get married and then you get divorced and people, it's just life, this happens. But the way we grew up is that no, everyone's marriage is mediocre.
The point after that is regarding prayer, from 238 to 239. حافظوا على الصلوات والصلاة الوسطى وقوموا لله قانتين فإن خفتم فرجالا أو ركبانا فإذا أمنتم فاذكروا الله كما علمكم ما لم تكونوا تعلمون. Hold on to all your prayers, preserve them, especially the middle prayer of the day, and stand to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala qaniteen, with full submission and acceptance and love for Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you're in a state of fear, then pray whether you're walking, or pray if you're sitting, if you're riding your horse, and pray while walking or riding if you're in a state of fear and you can't. And again, these are going to be detailed. This is going to be detailed again later in Surat Al-Nisa, but the concept is there, the perspective is being given. You always preserve your prayer, you always pray regardless of the situation that you're in. You may say, well, why didn't he detail the ritual of prayer in Surat Al-Baqara? Well, because the concept of prayer is repeated so many times. At least 15 times, the concept of iqam al-salah or salah is repeated in Surah Al-Baqarah, so there's no need to go into the details of the ritual. However, siyam, for example, is not talked about in Surah Al-Baqarah a lot. That's why the one time it is, there's details. The same thing goes for hajj, the same thing goes for zakah. However, salah is repeated so many times, and at the beginning of the surah, even, and towards the end, all throughout the surah, from the beginning to the end, that there's no need to go into the details of how it's going to happen. That's going to be something you're going to learn from the Prophet ﷺ later, and there'll be details to follow in other surahs. Then regarding women's personal freedoms, from 240 to 42, وَالَّذِينَ يُتَوَفَّوْنَ مِنْكُمْ وَيَذَرُونَ أَزْوَاجًا وَصِيَّةً لِأَزْوَاجِهِمْ مَتَاعًا إِلَى الْحَوْلِ غَيْرَ إِخْرَاجٍ فَإِنْ خَرَجْنَ فَلَا جُنَاحَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِيمَا فَعَلْنَ فِي أَنفُسِهِنَّ مِنْ مَعْرُوفٍ. It's talking about some of the ritual, some of the laws regarding when a woman is widowed and her husband passes away. And then in the middle of the ayah there's فَإِنْ خَرَجْنَ, and if they choose to leave their homes, فَلَا جُنَاحَ عَلَيْكُمْ فِيمَا فَعَلْنَ فِي أَنفُسِهِنَّ مِنْ مَعْرُوفٍ. You don't have the ability to control them or to deny them their rights to leaving their house and pursuing a job or pursuing another marriage or pursuing whatever they want to pursue in the name of religion or the name of the fact that you're scared for her, unless she is engaging herself. Look, the word ma'ruf is there again, min ma'ruf. As long as she's not doing something that is socially out of the norm, then you have no reason, you have no right to deprive her. And this ayah was problematic at the time it was revealed, because it's talking about the rights of women, the freedoms the women that didn't have during the time, and it's attesting to their personal freedoms that they were denied during a certain point in history, and sometimes still are. So if you take a look at what we've talked about so far, look at the details of the methodology regarding food, behavior, retribution, inheritance, fasting, corruption, bearing arms for the sake of defense, hajj, hypocrisy, charity, bearing arms for the sake of freedom of religion, alcohol and gambling, regarding orphans, regarding marriage and all the relationships that come before it, during it, and after it, regarding prayer, regarding women's personal freedoms. All these issues are details of the methodology of Islam that you're going to use to fulfill your goal, your purpose as a Khalifa, and it's talking about them sporadically to give you a mosaic of issues that are all equally important. Yes, there are priorities, but they're all important. You can't choose one and leave out the other. And we're going to be continuing, inshallah, to talk about the rest of these points in the next halaqah. Subhanakallah bihamdik, la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk, wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.